Hello everyone, my name is Haleh Liza Gafori, and I'm very excited to present this course on the life and poetry of one of the greatest poets who's ever lived, the 13th century Persian sage and mystic, Jalaluddin Muhammad ibn Hussein Balkhi, otherwise known as Maulana, otherwise known as Mevlana, otherwise known as Rumi. Maulana Rumi left us a tremendous body of work, thousands upon thousands of poems. He was a fountain of leaping thought and dazzling images who often composed spontaneously, and oftentimes, especially in the last decade of his life, he would have friends and disciples even following him around and taking down the poems as he spontaneously composed them. In his poetry, we can see that he was a master of meter, metaphor, form, and wordplay. And also, and perhaps more importantly, we can feel his heart. We can feel his warmth, his devotion, his care, and his concern. Rumi is rooting for humanity in his poetry. He calls us again and again to love. And this love appears in many forms in his poems. So through the course, we're going to hear the many ways that he describes this force. He believed that love is a transformative and liberating force. He believed in the ubiquity of this love. He believed that we emerged from it. He believed that it is a primordial force at the root of our being, and that our greatest mission on this earth is to uncover this love, to cultivate this love, to activate and practice this love in our daily lives. Throughout Rumi's poetry, we hear his multifaceted voice. He comes forth as an ecstatic lover, as a humble seeker, as a ravaged devotee, as a wide-eyed witness, as a kind and discerning sage, and as a spiritual guide. And when he comes forth as a guide, sometimes speaking with great intensity and telling us what to do, sometimes gently inquiring, he never, though, comes forth as a holier-than-thou saint. He always comes forth as a friend. He always comes forth as someone who understands the struggle of human existence and is willing to speak honestly about his own struggle, to speak honestly about his own process of transformation, possibly inspiring ours. His belief in transformation, his belief in the ability to alchemize consciousness, to move beyond delusions of separation, beyond dogma, beyond stifling self-interest into deeper levels of love and compassion, is central to his poetry. If we're speaking of alchemy, we should also then speak of gold. And to him, the true gold of existence is not the precious metal, but a feeling state. To him, the true gold of existence is this deep love that we activate. It is the feeling of communion that we experience with ourselves, with each other, with the natural world, and with the divine that he believed pulses through all of it. It's important to note that Rumi was not writing in some kind of, separate utopian bubble. He lived in tumultuous times. He was aware of the horrors of war. At the time that he was alive, the Mongolian armies were marching across Central Asia. And at times, his family had to flee ahead of the invasions. So he is responding to this. He's responding to a range of realities. I like to think of his poetry as muscular poetry because he's carrying the range of possibility and he's responding to it. And so his poetry acts on an aesthetic and sensual level, on a personal level, on a spiritual level, and also on a socio-political level. His poetry is responding and shaking the foundations of hierarchical thinking, of paradigms of domination and subordination, of polarizing thinking that leads to so much catastrophe. One thing that's true about humans is that we have the tendency to remember and forget, to remember and forget. So you can think about Maulana Rumi's poetry as a poetry of remembrance. He is reminding us that we can steer our minds. He is reminding us of our interconnection. He is reminding us of the beauty of the natural world. He's reminding us of the divine that lives within and of this great call to uncover it. So since I started translating in 2016, I've had the pleasure and privilege of being reminded over and over again. And his poetry has a way of working on us, working through us. And I want to share a little bit about my journey with his poetry so you understand a little about where I'm coming from and how I got into this. So first to say that, I started translating in 2016, and since then, my translations have been published in 2 books. The first one is Gold, which was released in 2022, and the second is Water, which was released in 2025. And in this course, I will draw from these books. We'll be looking at poems from these books. We'll be hearing some excerpts in Persian. I'll be commenting on them and commenting on certain lines and certain words, possibly that have no one-to-one equivalent in English and so on. I'll also bring in a little more from the Masnavi. These books are mostly translations of poems in the Divan-e-Shams, which we'll talk about later. But there's a dash from the Masnavi. I'll bring in a little more, and I'll bring in a little from discourses during this course. I first heard Maulana Rumi's poetry when I was a child. My parents came from Iran in the 1970s with 1 suitcase of clothing and 2 suitcases of books. And in one of those suitcases were the 2 giant books by Maulana Rumi, the Divan-e-Shams and the Masnavi. And my parents loved reciting these poems. They would get together with other Iranian people that they met in the area. They'd have Shab-e-Shares, nightly poetry readings, and I would sit on the fringes and listen in. I remember hearing my father recite this poem, یک خانه پر ز مستان مستان نو رسیدند دیوانگان بندی زنجیرها دریدند جانهای جمله مستان دلهای دل پرستان ناگه قفس شکستند چون مرغ برپریدند. At the time when I heard this poem, I was a kid. I didn't understand the depth of meaning here, but I remembered the rhythm. I remembered the energy of it. I remember how much my parents enjoyed the poetry. And since that moment, Rumi would spiral through my life. Eventually I was reading translations. Eventually I was singing some of his poems. His poems have an inherent rhythm. He was often composing to the beat of the drum. So in a way they call out to singers and say, sing me. So I did at times sing his poems. And then in 2016, there was a translation on my desk and I looked at it and I wondered, is that what he said? And I looked at the original and I felt that it begged for another version. So I gave it a shot and I was hooked. Translation is an incredibly intimate way of engaging with poetry. The translator must eat the poem, as he says, eat my poetry like Egyptian bread, right? The translator eats the poem, lets it pulse through them. I was walking with the poem, I was waking with the poem, I was riding the trains with the poems, walking through the park with the poems. They were working through me and on me, and it was a tremendous pleasure. It's also like solving a puzzle, translation. It's also a process of collaborating with another psyche and another heart. And the job of the translator is to transmit the poem from the music of one language into the music of another language. Sometimes the job is to unpack words that have no one-to-one equivalent in the target language. Sometimes the translator needs to look at the ancient meanings or the old meanings of certain words, right? Because language evolves. So what a word meant 800 years ago might be different than what it needs now. So sometimes there's an aspect of research involved. One also has to look at the more elusive lines, right? Sometimes the lines can be translated literally and they really work, but a lot of times they require some level of interpretation. So the translator should be using the body of work and the cultural context in order to get clues and make an informed interpretation. So all of this is happening during the translation process. I also read alongside my mom some of these poems. She was an incredible resource. She has impeccable Persian, and it was an incredible way for us to be in conversation, to talk about these poems, to look at the backstories. My great-grandmother, my grandmother, her great-grandmother, and my great-grandmother, and her mother, and they were all in love with words. And so in a way, I was sort of continuing this lineage of, women who are engaged with text and love to tell the stories, love to transmit the meanings. So that was also happening during this process without me really being aware of it. So as I mentioned, I drew the poems in these two books, largely from his book, Divan-e-Shams, which contains over 5,000 poems. So the selection process is a big part of this, right? Sitting there and looking through poems and saying, oh my God, I love this one. I want to translate this one. Or, oh my God, I love this one. And of course, the heart and psyche, personality and culture in which the translator is growing up may very well determine which poems they pick, right? So there's a lot of variation in our selections. Also, these poems in the Divan-e-Shams are either quatrains, which are 4-line poems, or these longer poems called ghazals. And I want to talk about the ghazal form for a moment and say that it is a series of couplets, and they are connected by a repeating word or phrase that appears at the end of each couplet. Now, each of these couplets, essentially in most of the poems, because these are not narrative poems, can be plucked out of the poem and it can stand on its own, almost like a string of tweets, for instance, right? So you can pluck one poem out and you can look, wow, this is like a dazzling poem in and of itself. So another source of variation between translators is which couplets are they picking? Are they doing the entire ghazal, or are they choosing couplet 1, 3, 5, 7, right? This is a source of variation. Editors in Iran who are putting out books of Rumi and aren't even translating them also pick out their favorite couplets. So this is kind of a tradition. This is something that's pretty common. Vocalists will take a 16-couplet ghazal and say pick 3 or 4 couplets and sing those in a song. And as I said, translators will sometimes also engage in this process. I love it when I am driven to translate the whole ghazal, but honestly, sometimes you look at a ghazal and you say, oh my God, these 4 couplets make such a wonderful poem. I'm going to stick with those. So that does happen. I want to recite one ghazal for you now, just so that you get a sense of the repeated phrase. This is one where I maintained the repetition at the end. One doesn't always do that. Sometimes it works better when the repeated word kind of slinks through the poem. So you'll hear certain translations like that. Sometimes also, I should say, is that it's a rhyme and not a repeated word. So then in translation, there's actually no rhyme and no repetition. So that also happens. But let's hear one where we do hear the refrain at the end. He says, the spring of souls is here. Fresh branch, budding branch, come and dance. And you, dear lion, so fierce and hot-tempered, come and dance. You surrendered your head and feet, headless and footless, come and dance. And you, rare king, true king, nourishing as mother's milk, come and dance. A man arrived with sword in hand and venom on his tongue. Evil dwells here, he said. And so does good, my friend. Come and dance. Lovers whirl in devotion, ecstasy their crown. Where they are, what use is the royal cloak? Beautiful one, dressed to serve, come and dance. You who are drunk on self, 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 union is your destiny. Dissolution is your destiny. The map is in your hand. Taste the rapture now. Come and dance. If you're my beloved bearing a cup of wine, or you're a branch bearing no fruit, come and dance. The war is over. The band is singing. Come and dance. Unfurling its dazzling wings, the peacock calls to the bird of the soul. You, without wing and feather, come and dance. So there you hear an example of the ghazal. And here is a little bit in Persian. I pulled some lines and couplets just so you can hear a little bit of the rhythm. آمد این بهار جانها ای شاخ تر به رقصا از پا و سر بریدی بی پا و سر به رقصا ای مست هست گشته بر تو فنا نبشته روغه فنا رسیده بحر سفر به رقصا طاووس ما درآید و آن رنگها برآید به مرغ جان سرآید بی بال و پر به رقصا. So you heard that به رقصا, dance, dance, dance. And this is an example of one of his poems where he is inviting us and inviting us and inviting us again and again into a state of ecstasy, into a state of communion.